The Palmetto State has two major industrial sources of asbestos exposure: shipbuilding and repair, and power generation plants. For many reasons, these two industries have some of the highest rates of asbestos-related disease victims. Natural deposits. South Carolina also has abundant deposits of serpentine, from which comes the common chrysotile variety of asbestos. Indeed, serpentine was once mined in the state, and several other sites were prospected. These deposits are heavily concentrated in the northwestern corner of the state in the foothills region, along its common boundary with North Carolina and Georgia. Additional deposits are located along the eastern slope of the Appalachian Mountain Range and the Piedmont. Two of these are located along the North Carolina state line within Kings Mountain State Park. The other three are located further south and slightly to the west in lightly populated that roughly parallel State Route 97. The shipyards. When the SS Morro Castle burned off the New Jersey coast in 1934, it turned the attention of maritime industries to the dangers of fire at sea. Shipboard fires have an unfortunate tendency to start without warning and to burn very fast and hot. Should the fire get out of control, there is no escape except to abandon ship. This is the reason asbestos insulation was used in great amounts in the construction of seagoing vessels between the mid-1930s and 1980. The insulation was generally applied as slurry or sprayed on, forming a hard shell as it dried. However, as it was applied, workers were liable to inhale the fibers, which would become incredibly concentrated in the closed environment below decks. As the insulation in these vessels aged and deteriorated, it became friable. In other words, it began to crumble and release fibers into the air. These are the main reasons that shipyard workers suffer from a relatively high rate of asbestos disease. A recent study conducted at the National Cancer Institute in Bethesda, Maryland, confirms that shipyard workers have a small but significant excess mortality from all causes: lung cancer and mesothelioma, most of which is probably related to asbestos exposure. The power plants. Power plant workers face a high level of risk as well, and for many of the same reasons. Depending on how the plant is fueled, there is usually a risk of fire. In addition, certain types of asbestos, particularly crucidolite, a deadly form of amphibole asbestos, have a high degree of resistance to electrical current. Machinery found in power plants might have asbestos insulation in any number of places, particularly boilers and turbines. Often, this was in the form of a sprayed-on slurry such as Monocoat, a product of the infamous W.R. Grace Corporation, the main operation of which was located in Libby, Montana, a small town that gained national attention because of the high rate of asbestos poisoning among workers. Gaskets that were used in sealing valves, pumps, and pipe fittings were also made from asbestos-containing materials, or ACMs. To fit these gaskets in place properly required plant maintenance workers to cut, trim, and file these components. As a result, these ACMs became friable, and asbestos dust was subsequently inhaled by these workers. South Carolinian mortality rates. Over the 20-year period between 1980 and 2000, during which the state's population grew by nearly a third, 634 South Carolinians lost the battle against asbestos disease. Mesothelioma victims outnumbered asbestosis ones slightly. The overwhelming majority of these deaths were in and around Charleston, which is the most populated and industrialized part of the state. Legal resources in South Carolina. A search through the South Carolina Federal District Court cases for asbestos-related personal injury product liability lawsuits brings up an extensive list of nearly 50 lawsuits from 2006 and 2007. In a majority of these cases, the defendant is Aquachem Incorporated. South Carolina is ranked 29 in the U.S. for mesothelioma cases. With a mesothelioma mortality rate of 8.4 per million, South Carolina has a crude mortality rank of 40 in the country. South Carolina has a number of known asbestos-exposed areas. These include the Carolina Shipping Company and the Charleston Navy Yard in Charleston, Greenville Computer Processing in Greenville, and Detyen's Shipyards Incorporated in North Charleston. Individuals living or working near these areas should be checked regularly for signs of mesothelioma in order to file any lawsuits within the state's statute of limitations. While many of these sites have been inspected and some have been cleaned up, anyone who worked or lived in these areas before asbestos contamination was reported can still be affected. Also, it is important to keep in mind that these are only known asbestos sites. Other areas in the state may also contain asbestos, but may have not yet been reported as such. One key case in the state involving asbestos was Kershaw County Board of Education versus U.S. Gypsum Company, in which the school board sued the manufacturer of the ceiling plaster installed in many of Kershaw County's schools, claiming the plaster contained asbestos. The trial court issued an order requiring the manufacturer to be notified prior to any asbestos being removed. In spite of this order, the school board failed to notify U.S. Gypsum before beginning asbestos abatement at one of its schools. The company moved for judgment in its favor on the claims related to that school. The trial court denied the motion. Another key case was Murphy versus Owens Corning Fiberglass Corporation. The plaintiff's father was a chemical engineer at E.I. DuPont between 1951 and 1984. As part of his work, the father was exposed to asbestos. In July of 1995, the plaintiff, Janet Murphy, was diagnosed with mesothelioma. She brought this tort action in South Carolina, and her husband also brought a loss of consortium suit. They alleged that Janet developed mesothelioma because her childhood exposure to asbestos dust and fibers in her father's clothing, and that while her father was subject to asbestos exposure at all of the defendant's facilities, it was greatest at the South Carolina plant. The defendant moved to dismiss the claims on grounds in light of South Carolina's door-closing statute, since the plaintiff and her husband no longer lived in South Carolina, and since she developed mesothelioma while living elsewhere. The plaintiff died while the case was being tried. The lower court ruled the defendant's favor, but the Court of Appeals reversed the decision, ruling that the asbestos exposure occurred while Janet lived in South Carolina, and so it was valid for the case to be filed there. Those interested in filing lawsuits should know that the statute of limitations for personal injury law in South Carolina is 3 years with a discovery rule that states that this amount of time begins when the problem, in this case the mesothelioma, either was discovered or should have been discovered. Wrongful death cases follow the same statute of limitations and discovery rule. There is no specific statute about asbestos in South Carolina.
Okay.
Thank you for watching. This video was produced by Asbestos.Net, a leading resource on all aspects of asbestos and mesothelioma. Our priority is to inform victims about the devastating effects of asbestos exposure, mesothelioma, asbestos cancer, asbestosis, and other asbestos-related diseases, and to advise them with a wealth of information. Individuals whose lives have been touched by mesothelioma have numerous questions and concerns. Their caregivers and family members also need accurate, reliable information. If you or a loved one have been diagnosed with mesothelioma or asbestos cancer and need more information, we invite you to visit and explore the thousands of pages of oncologist-reviewed material on Asbestos.net, to call our convenient toll-free number shown below and speak with a mesothelioma specialist, or to use the simple contact form found at Asbestos.net to request a free copy of our informative books, custom inserts, and DVD. Asbestos.net. Information and help for patients and families.